Hello, my name is Naomi, and I'm excited to talk to you today about the horror genre. First, brief, history. There we go. All right, so horror often is tracked from early Gothic fiction. Early Gothic fiction tended to portray the terrifying, was set in archaic surroundings. There were supernatural elements, but they tend to be more in the margins of the tale, stereotyped characters, and there was a lot of suspense. Then we have pre-Victorian horror, so you start seeing Frankenstein, vampire, and of course Edgar Allan Poe, though he's more also publishing in Victorian, but I nudged him here. This is where the supernatural, or in other ways fantastic, like Frankenstein, takes more center stage. Then we have the usual suspects in Victorian horror. So then we have 20th century horror. Oh, sorry about that slide. But we have Turn of the Screw, which I bumped into 20th century because I can do what I want. And ghost stories really sort of was a major show for horror fiction in the early parts of the 20th century. M.R. James is a very prominent ghost story writer. He actually sort of made the template, I guess, of the ghost story. And The Haunting of Hill House to this day might be the most terrifying haunted house novel of all time, although Matheson's Hill House might be giving that a run for its money. We also have H.P. Lovecraft, who was a major author in the mid-20th century, or early mid-20th century. His Cthulhu mythos, the idea of these old gods that will overcome humanity, and was just filled with dread and a sense of doom, and are still an important part of horror culture to this day. The most popular podcast right now on iTunes is Welcome to Night Vale, and it also borrows a lot of elements from H.P. Lovecraft, while it's more comedic. Horror movies and literature interact quite a bit. I think Joyce Sarix argues that horror was sort of going on in literature a downward trend in the 40s and 50s, but the popularity of horror movies brought it back. The figures from horror literature appear again and again in film, often completely transformed. So Dracula, now people are more likely to think of him as Gary Oldman, Bela Lugosi, Jonathan Rhys-Meyers most recently, and Frankenstein's monster is now known as Frankenstein and doesn't speak a word of French. Also, major horror novels tend to get on the big stage through films. For instance, Carrie and Interview with the Vampire. So these are the start of modern horror fiction. Again, this is heavy presentation, so I'm making a lot of generalizations here. Everything I say might be a little bit of a lie. So Carrie was first published in 1974, and Stephen King published 50 times per year ever since then, but his works are still really great. And we have Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, and more on them later. So what is horror fiction? The appeal of horror fiction is emotional. It's there to frighten the reader. There is menacing atmosphere in the story. The tone can vary in a horror work of fiction. So Christopher Moore, Robert Shearman tend to have more of a comedic tone, sardonic in their stories, but there's still that menacing surroundings. And monsters frame the stories. The monsters may not be supernatural, but to compare it to, let's say, very graphic thriller fiction, you're never under the point of view of the monster. That remains sort of shuttered away from the reader. Often includes graphic violence, strong language, explicit sexual situations. So if someone is new to horror as a new horror reader, sometimes it's appropriate to maybe gauge their comfort level with these elements when giving readers advisory. There are unresolved endings. For instance, in mysteries, with David's story, it would be more the mystery of why these people are missing their faces. And included in the mystery would be a resolution. With horror, really the reason why these things are happening, sometimes they're explained, sometimes they're not. What is happening is often not the main point. The main point is to just have them happen to frighten the reader. There's rich language, so adjectives and descriptions. I think in the Dunwich Horrors, H.P. Lovecraft, they are the blasphemous fish frogs of the nameless design. It's still one of my favorite lines in literature. So Stephen King argues that horror movies and horror books appeal grows in an economic downturn, which is something interesting to think about. They offer escapism because the reader can get very entrapped by what's happening in the novel itself, and it's very easy to forget about their own situations. You're experiencing terror, but in a safe environment and with more control than you would have, let's say, while watching a horror film. And there are a lot of surprises in horror fiction, although part of the fear appeal of horror fiction is also knowing what's going to happen, dreading what's going to happen, and then it happens. And also, it's fun, because you have that little bits of interruptions. Serix argues that horror pacing style is actually a better way to provide readers advisory than necessarily relying on the genres at which monsters appear in the story and menaces the readers. So the storyteller style, so the sinister mood is built up slowly, and then there's that graphically violent climax, or visceral. So it's violent and intense violence from early on, and it doesn't let up. So Stephen King, Shirley Jackson, Dean Koontz are more in the storyteller model, although they can fluctuate. And for visceral violence, Anne Rice, Max Brooks, and Clive Barker. So more general tips and tricks. The good question to ask when providing readers advisory isn't what parts of the book did you like, or what books did you like, but what were the scariest parts from a book or a short story that they enjoyed. There are a lot of short story anthologies and collections in horror. Many major horror titles are first published in magazines and zines. Here are some examples of collections of major authors and anthologies. Some have sort of haven't been published recently. So there are graphic novels that are really great for horror because they have that sort of visceral reaction. Junji Ito was already discussed. So we have Tales of the Crypt, Robert Kirkman, The Walking Dead. And then we have nonfiction, which can also be very appropriate when giving horror readers advisory. Anything that's of the macabre or that sort of features ghost stories, even if they're not, it's sort of written in a descriptive, fictional, non-fictional way. So this is a checklist that was provided, I believe, in the Reader's Advisory Guide Horror of potential new horror readers. So if they follow maybe 4 of the 3 checklists, you may want to feel free just providing suggestions for horror books. Let's say they're finished reading everything they say in the thriller collection and they want to try and branch out. But out of 2 out of 4, you can still recommend horror novels, but maybe take the time, try to find precisely the right one, the right level of graphic violence. Where are they on the storyteller versus visual scale? Here we have helpful resources. So the Bram Stoker Award is very helpful because it also includes long story, short stories, novel, Lifetime Achievement Awards, very descriptive. Weird Tales magazine has been publishing for decades, and I think it's still publishing online. There are a few blogs, including, I want to point out, RA for Horror, for All Horror, blogspot.ca, which is, I think, maintained by Becky Siegel, who has written the Reader's Advisory Guide to Horror. And these are some helpful resources that I used to prepare for our presentation. Thank you.